This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you. Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan, and I am here with Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I guess it's on YouTube now, so I guess, I don't know, maybe I should say the show or whatever people say. I'm here with Adam Mastroianni, and he is a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia Business School. And I think he's a social psychologist, and we're going to talk about that a little later. And he also has a Substack, Experimental History, which I think, Adam, you have talked about the fact that people sometimes misunderstand what the Substack initially is because of the and I was just like, wait, because I read some of your stuff, just so the listeners know. I read some of your stuff coming off the internet, and we'll talk about that first, so off Twitter, and I didn't pay attention to what your Substack was called, and then later I went back to your Substack independently, and I was like, wait, it's called Experimental History. Wait, what does this have to do with history? So you're gonna be a big enough deal that people are gonna ignore that little a little misdirection. Anyway, I think I introduced you a little. You can introduce yourself more if you want, or we can just go into peer review and why it's a big deal, why your post on peer review became a big deal, and where we go from here with peer review. So take it away.
I guess I am a social psychologist, although, I got my PhD in psychology working with a social psychologist, which I guess is what qualifies you to be one. During the day, I teach negotiation to MBAs at Columbia Business School. That's my day job. But really, my love and my real job is writing that Substack called Experimental History, which is a terrible name for a blog that's mainly about psychology. But that's sort of a purposeful misdirect that I'm trying to make a point there that I think we can get into later.
Yeah, and so I have a lot of people listening to this know about my Substack. Some of them just subscribe off Spotify or something, and you illiterates just listen to podcasts. But let's set that aside, because there are people like that. I know you exist because you reach out to me. But in any case, you're saying your blog, and I have a blog too. I do have to say, our mutual friend, what was it? So many years ago, do you know who Gregory Benford is, a science fiction writer?
No.
So he's a science fiction writer. He's written a lot of science fiction, but he was also, I think, a professor of physics at UC Santa Barbara before he retired. And, he was described once as what if a physicist swallowed an English professor in terms of his prose style. And, I think Erik, I'm going to praise him because he's not here, so he's not going to be embarrassed. But I feel that about him. What if a scientist swallowed a literary fiction writer, which I think, he kind of is in a way. So, it's a blog, yes, but, he is a writer, and his work is very writerly. I think, I think I try to do something that's a little more long form, a little depth. And I think you try to do the same thing too. I think you were pretty explicit on your podcast with Erik, which I'll link to, so people can listen to that if they want to, that, you kind of looked at what he did and you're like, oh, this is cool. And so I just want to be clear. You're trying to do something kind of different and related to science. And I don't know if we have a good word for what that is. I think that was clear in the conversation between you and Erik, because you guys are both what are we doing here? And I feel like I'm a little bit in the same vein as well. And so I just want to put that out there so that people understand, and, everyone should check out your Substack, obviously, and the link is there. But I just want to make that clear. What do we mean by blog? A blog could be this is the experimental method, because there are scientists who are okay, this is the experimental method. It's on their lab website, and that's a blog. And then there's what Erik is doing, and that's a blog. So,
Hmm.
and your piece on peer review is also a blog, and I don't know how much traffic you got, but people wouldn't shut up about it for weeks. So that's obviously a whole different thing. You touched you touched some nerves. You went viral, bro. You went viral. And why did you go viral? Can you tell us? Can you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, I think it's because I pulled the internet slot machine and it came up it came up all stars or however a slot machine works. It's funny when I went to post that piece, I was like, this is kind of inside baseball. Like it's a pretty niche topic. I think a lot of people who read what I do, like some of them are scientists, some of them aren't. Like this one probably won't get read that much, and then it became the most read thing that I've ever done. And I think it was a bit because it touched a nerve because I think it said a thing that a lot of people believe but don't want to say out loud, which is sort of an emperor has no clothes kind of moment where it's like the way that we treat this thing we call peer review as some kind of quality assurance doesn't really do that, and in fact might cost more than it benefits us, and is historically weird, and it's worth doing something else. And so I wrote that piece after a few weeks after I had just written and posted a scientific paper online. So I had written it like I would write in my normal voice. And I said, here's what we did. And if you want to know more about it, like here's the data, here's the code, here are the materials. But the blog post itself for 99.9% of people is everything you need to understand what we did, why we did it, why we think it matters. Um, and, and this post was sort of a follow up to that being like, that's kind of why I did it, that I don't see any benefit actually of putting that paper in a journal. I have everything that I want from posting that paper on the internet because it got a ton of attention and people responded to it. People sent me reviews. They sent me annotated PDFs. I heard from the people that I cited in it. And I was like, well, what could a journal possibly give me that I didn't already get? And so this is sort of in a sequence with that piece as well.
Yeah, and actually, I just have to say, I have been thinking about this. I was in academia before I entered the startup world, like about like 6 years ago now. I did write. I don't know. Some of you might know about this, but probably not. I wrote a piece with my friend David Middleman, Laurie Goodman, for Genome Biology, dragging scientific publication to the 21st century. This was in 2014, and I think my hypothesis is this system's not sustainable. It's going to collapse. There's going to be kind of a preference cascade, but we're still here. So
Yeah.
almost 10 years, we're still here. So someday it will change. The status quo will change, I still believe. And it'll happen very fast because many people are very, very unhappy. This is why your piece went viral. And just to describe, peer review in its, just the details of what it is, it's like, okay, like, so you have an editor at some publication. There are like 20,000 or whatever now. So we're not talking
Yeah.
Nature or Science. We're talking just like, a lot of regular publications. You send out a manuscript and, they have to find people who are peers who can review it. And most of the time, I think it's blind, although sometimes now they're having various, different ways to indicate that. And, often it's a situation where there's literally like only 6 people that are good candidates.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, you kind of know who's going to be looking at it. And, so that's your peer who has a veto on you. So, there's shenanigans that can happen. Like, I mean, really, this happened 20 years ago. So I think I can say it now in terms of, I'm not going to name names, but, people sit on papers um, and keep getting it through peer review. And then they know that someone in their own lab is working on something similar. And it comes out and everyone
Yeah.
knows after the fact what happened. But so this is like the peer review used in scientific politics, right? So it can be used for, frankly, that was evil. What was really much more concrete, what a mentor of mine once told me was like, I would love to do peer review because, I would get to see the results ahead of time. But now with preprints, the value of that is really decreasing a lot. So preprints are, okay, you write it up and you just put it out there, and eventually it's going to go into the peer review system usually, uh, and you could also get some pre-publication or early review, early feedback. The problem is, I think functionally there's too many preprints, and everything is subject to a power law, and a few preprints get a lot of feedback and it works, but most of them are just out there.
Yep.
So that's fundamentally part of the problem. But you talk about the fact that if you're in academia now, it's like it's been around, like it's been like this forever. It hasn't.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the history of it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how short our memories are because, yeah, it feels like I came into this field and people were like, and as did Pharaoh and the scribes before us for centuries, it's been this way, and really, if you look at it, like there are things like peer review that have been around for a long time, but this thing that we have now, which is basically universal peer review, is pretty new. It's about a generation old. Somewhere in the 1960s or 70s is where we got rid of most of the other stuff. And up until that point, all of scientific publishing had been a pretty diverse hodgepodge. There were some scientific societies that would be publishing the things that their members were doing. There were scientists sending letters to one another. There were basically magazines reporting on science. And all of these were ways that you could publish your science. And it's really hard to reconstruct, I think, like what the prestige hierarchy was, but it doesn't seem clear that everybody knew, like, yes, if you get it over here, like that's prestigious, and over here that isn't. However prestige was working in science was administrated some other way other than the way that you publish your paper. These days, it's not that way. And everybody knows that, like, getting a paper into Science or Nature is the best. And after that, there's a few other general science journals. And after that, there's a clear hierarchy in your field. And that's all also new. And so this idea that the only way that a finding enters the scientific record or is like socially co-registered, that we all agree that this has happened, is you send it to a peer-reviewed journal, they send it out and they publish it. That part is very historically strange. And I think one anecdote that illustrates this is Einstein only ever had one paper that was peer-reviewed, and he didn't realize it was going to happen. And he was so angry that it had happened that he pulled that paper and published it somewhere else. So even 100 years ago, the idea that this would be what you do de facto was kind of crazy.
Yeah. So let's talk about this in a meta way a little bit. A lot of times, academics today, the way we're trained, let's say past tense, I was right. So is the peer review system, the publication system, that is science qua science. But that's not how it always was. Science has existed since at least the 1600s, if you take a narrow view, and for thousands of years, if you take a broad view, right? So what is science? Science is, you can say it's a method, but it's not like a specific method. Like Popper didn't have this method like 300 years ago. So science has been around for a long time, and it's had different instantiations, different enculturations, right? It's encultured in different ways. So science was professionalized. They're professional scientists, and these professional scientists now need to have metrics to justify their grants. So the metrics are the publications. So this has been subject to Goodhart's rule, where when you have a measure, and you have a measure that's explicit, people start aiming for the measure as opposed to what they're actually supposed to be doing, which is science. And that's just the reality. I'm sure we could tell many stories. Everyone within academia knows how this works. It's a little weird to people outside of academia, including like bizarre things that I took for granted to such an extent that I didn't understand that other right. So my friend Thomas Chatterton Williams, prominent writer, he was shocked that scientists don't get paid. I'm laughing.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone who's a scientist or has been in academia is laughing right now that this would be shocking reveal.
Yeah.
In fact, you quite often have to pay in certain journals, open access, to get it out there, or to get like color figures and all this stuff. So this is all like a local like enculturation of how science is done, but there's nothing fundamentally deep about peer review. And I will let you comment on this, but I do want to say one thing that really annoys me about peer review, and you said this in your podcast with Erik, is once something is peer reviewed and it's published out there, it has the patina of truth, and it's really annoying when it just happens to be wrong to the point, but not wrong in a way that can be retractable. So there are papers out there. I'll give the listeners a concrete example so that they can. It's not as abstract. There's a paper that was published in 2013 that showed that Australian Aborigines in Northern Territory had 10% Indian ancestry. It was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Science. So, not Nature, Cell, whatever, but Science, but like just below. It's peer reviewed, it's published, it's out there. The statistics just are kind of messed up for some weird way. I don't think there was any fraud. And there's nothing where it's like it should be retracted, but nobody really believes that result. And so people will point that result to me, and I will just have to say, nobody believes that result. But I'm having to do this for 10 years now.
Yeah.
Can I just put a note on the top of PNAS? Nobody believes this result. I don't want to I don't want there to be a retraction. I don't want to cause a problem for the authors. Stuff happens that's not robust. That happens. Maybe that's what I should say. It's not robust, but normal people don't know what that means in that context. So I just say, look, the result's not a real result. Can you just stop telling me about this peer-reviewed paper in a prestigious journal? It's an awkward thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah, which I think is a great example that the way that we form scientific consensus, or the way that we build progress, it isn't exactly that the papers come out and they're all vetted and then they go into the scientific record, because we know exactly things like this happen. I mean, we know a good chunk of these papers are fraudulent or would never replicate, or there's various issues with them. And in the long term, I do think that all generally works out. In the short term, which is what we really want, I think, peer review to do for us, to tell us what's true and not true in the short term, that doesn't work out. Because to actually do the vetting that it takes to really tell whether a paper is true or not is a ton of work. And I think virtually no paper actually deserves that amount of attention. And when we pretend that we've given it that amount of attention, I think we end up worse off, because we're like, well, I mean, it's been peer reviewed, and so who is to say that it's untrue? Other than literally everybody, because you can read it for yourself and see whether it's true or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've been a peer reviewer. I've been a peer reviewer. Sometimes, it just depends on. Okay, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying it, but sometimes, you don't put that much work into it. Sometimes you do. There's variance. Okay, there's other things. There's trade offs, and I don't feel great about not digging as deep as I should. But hey, a lot of times, this was back when I was in graduate school. Because I didn't stay in academia very long. And, they were desperate to find someone to review, say, a mammalian genomics paper. Okay. Concretely, this is what's happening. And so I'm doing them a mitzvah. So I'm just okay, you know what? I can't devote that much time, but I will. And there's just a lot of suboptimality here. But the issue is it's still called peer review. You don't know how much effort the peer put in. You don't know who they are, so there's all of this variance going in. And, it's how the sausage is made makes it seem a lot less abstract and elegant and kind of highfalutin, and I think when people say, because people will say to me and these are often scientists, they will say, this is a peer-reviewed paper, I'm just come on, in your own, this is a form of Gell-Mann's amnesia, because I'm just in your own field you would never say that, because which papers are real and which aren't.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I think whenever someone says that, basically they're saying, well, someone else did my homework for me. And it's unfortunately, if you really want to know whether something's true or not, you do have to apply some labor. And I think the solution isn't, well, apply 10 times more labor and figure out whether each thing is true or not. I think it is actually hold each truth much more loosely and understand that these things are speculative. A lot of them are going to be untrue. We're probably not going to know right away which ones are true or untrue. A lot of them don't matter in the first place. And so this is sort of the stance that I develop toward any scientific claim that I see. And most of the time I'm just oh, well, could be. A lot of times I'm could not be. And very rarely am I do I feel definitely is. And I think that is the appropriate stance to encountering all these scientific claims where you can't actually spend the time that it would take to really evaluate them. And I think that is a level of rigor that should basically be reserved for the things that you need to be true in order for your work to be true.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing that I do have to say also, this is kind of unrelated to peer review. I just want to know what you think. Credentialism, in terms of credentialism is often very, very selective too, by the way. Sometimes you will hear oh, so and so is a biologist, they know about this topic, and I'm just there's really no such thing as a biologist. There's no one who studies biology. They studied one little domain in biology, and then outside of that, because I know a little bit of developmental genetics, a little bit, but I don't know that much. I mean, I really feel very uncomfortable evaluating any of that, talking about any of that beyond a random person on the street. Like the difference is, in my opinion, marginal. Population genetics, that's a different thing. Okay, so there's like this narrow specificity. So that's fair. On the other hand, I'm gonna be honest. I don't know what you think, because I honestly I don't know you that well, Adam. Okay, like I follow you on
Mhm.
Twitter. I read your stuff. I don't know you, as a person. I'm starting to get really annoyed recently about like, oh, so and so is a PhD. You should give them the respect of a PhD. And I'm just like, what the hell? No, and
No,
also like, let me be
no
honest.
way.
I've never had a physicist say, well, I have a PhD. I'm just
Mhm.
saying, in physics, they have a certain culture. Credentials don't, doesn't matter who you
Yeah,
are. And
yeah,
so I think that that's something that I'm seeing recently, and this is associated. I think this is related to the whole. Well, it's peer reviewed. Oh, it's in that
yes,
journal. We're forgetting what science is about, and science is about what you're saying, not who you are or how
yeah.
you did it. Anyway.
Yeah. I think whenever someone makes an argument like that, they're basically telling on themselves that they're like, I can't produce for you the arguments that would convince you. And so instead, I'm going to appeal to authority, which is basically no different from, holding up a Bible and saying, well, but it's in this book. And so therefore it is true. And I think the whole point of being an expert is you should have a better ability of producing arguments that are convincing to people. And if all you can say is, well, but I spent 6 years and now I have a document that says I spent 6 years doing this, and therefore you should trust me, that is a big red flag. I do not trust you. Because you also, I feel like, don't actually take me seriously if that's all you can tell me. That like, I understand that like, oh, maybe this actually might take a long time for me to be able to understand. But if you can't actually get me there, then I just have to have faith in you like I would a priest. And the whole point of us doing this thing is that we shouldn't have to do that. That like we don't have to rely on faith. We can verify.
Yeah, yeah, and I have thought sometimes like some scientists act like they are a priesthood. I mean, I will just like, this is kind of a little off topic, not part of like what we. So I was an early COVID hawk, and I will tell you, and I think I've said this in the podcast, so some listeners will know. Between like the last week of January and the last week of February of 2020, I was extremely stressed out. A lot of people also thought I was like mentally unstable because of what I would talk about all the time, the coming pandemic. Later they apologized I actually got texts from people.
Hmm.
They're like, we took some precautions because you seemed a little too crazy, and so I guess you weren't crazy anyway. But I follow mostly bio Twitter, mostly geneticists and stuff like that. And these are PhDs. A lot of them are also microbiologists, and everything was fine. So I was just like, am I insane? You know? And that, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like after that, I was just like, I don't really care the wisdom of the community, because
Yeah,
it was pretty obvious, in my opinion, what was happening at the end of January. And I just routinely would get like, okay, and I talked to other geneticists, like in my field, people, he's not there anymore, so I'm not gonna say his name, but friend who's a professor at Cornell, and he started freaking out like around February 10th. Like, all of us who were early, we remember the dates, you know?
hmm,
And so he started freaking out, and basically people in his department were like, "You're insane. Just get a grip." And I think that sort of thing shakes you, because you see, these experts, these people that you trust to think deeply about things, they're on autopilot a lot of the time. And so peer review, like going back to what we're talking about, these
yeah,
scientific frameworks, the credentialing, the institutions, they've taken on a life of their own. And I think like what conversation between you and Erik, I think you were talking about how getting a PhD is an apprenticeship, and what it's about is like grasping the truth that's out there. And I think sometimes we forget the forest from the trees here, and I
yeah,
think that's why your post about peer review elicited extremely strong opinions, because the people who agreed with it were like, yes, yes, this is true, but the people who
yeah,
disagreed with it, I'm not gonna lie, they know that it's touching at something real, and
yeah.
that's why they're enraged. Otherwise, they'd
Yeah.
ignore
Some
you.
people, yes. I think that this is again people telling on themselves. So I had literally a tenured professor in my comments being like, "Adam, are you still like a resident advisor at Quincy House at Harvard, which is a job I used to have?" like, I'm a Harvard alum and I have worries about your ability to mentor undergraduates. And like, this is very serious, like basically threatening my job on the internet. I mean, fortunately, a previous job. And I was like, man, in what world is this a good use of time for you? Like, how could a blog post by some random guy be worth this person descending from their tenured chair to be like, I want to get you fired? And I think it goes to show that, like, these are assumptions that people really don't appreciate having questioned, in large part because you benefit from them. A belief I think that underlies a lot of what we were just saying, but like, is this funny thing I've wanted to write about and I haven't gotten quite right yet, but this idea that we are at the end of science, which I think is kind of an unspoken but implicit assumption that a lot of people have, that just like, well, all these stories that we hear about the scientific consensus being overturned, those are in the past. Like, that won't happen to us now. Like, now we like pretty much got it down, and obviously we don't know everything, but like we're on the right track. Like, our understanding of the universe is not going to be revolutionized in the future. I think that's just wrong. And like, every past generation thought that as well. And so when there are cases where, the scientific consensus says one thing, and there are a few people saying another thing, and people go like, well, why can't you get on board with the consensus? I mean, maybe they're right, but maybe this is one of those cases where things are going to flip. I mean, there was a time when, people thought it was crazy, the idea that you should wash your hands between when you touch a cadaver and when you deliver a baby. And now we think it's crazy that you ever would do that. There will be things today that we feel that way about in the future. We just don't know which ones. And I think if you don't believe that, if you think that we're pretty much at the end, I understand why you would love peer review, because you really want to make sure that those T's are crossed and those I's are dotted appropriately, because like, we're kind of just finishing things up here. But if you think that there are big things left to discover, then I think you would favor strategies that actually increase the variance of the things that we're doing. That like, some things are going to be radically wrong, but some things might be radically right in a way that is at odds with our current understanding.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually like not very excited. Partly that mantras, like trust the science. I'm not actually a big fan of those. Partly because, I mean, look, I fly in airplanes. I trust that science. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of science. So like going back to COVID stuff, masking, we flipped multiple times, and the science is really uncertain. Actually, it just is.
Yeah.
And I'm not a pro or anti-masker. I was an early masker, I'll tell you, but. Whatever, like the science was uncertain. And I remember a friend of mine, Ionia Italia, she was like verbally abused by a scientist in early March for being a pro-masker. And then this scientist was verbally abusing anti-maskers in June. And she's like, what's going on here? It's just, the whole thing was just really weird that people behave this way. Like, they're 100% sure. Like, they have an opinion. It doesn't matter what the opinion is, but they're 100% sure. And I think what you were saying earlier about uncertainty is very well taken. And I think we all need to be more humble. And this is something that we need to all think about, because I think it is a human nature to kind of dig in and take whatever opinion you have and be maximalist, So in terms of uncertainty, as I said earlier, I'm a little uncertain what social psychology is. So tell me what it is.
Me too. I don't think anyone could really give you a good answer to this, but let me try. I think social psychology is experimental history, and that's why I call my Substack that, which is to say that regular historians wait for things to happen and then try to understand why they happened and what happened. I think social psychologists do exactly the same thing, except we construct those situations rather than waiting for them to occur. So we create a situation, whether it's asking someone a question or whether it's putting them in a situation. We observe what they do, and we try to make sense of it. And I think really the processes are very similar, and the only difference is whether you create the situation or not. And I think what we produce, much like what historians produce, is stories. And I know a lot of my colleagues don't like that word because it's become equated with like, oh, well, to publish a paper, you got to tell a good story. And telling a good story suggests that you are, glossing over the details or maybe lying a little bit, or you're leaving something out. But when I say story, I mean it in the most literal sense of people doing things in a place is inherently a story. And that is actually the knowledge that psychology produces. We have people do things in a place, And to talk about it any other way is actually to obscure what's really going on. And so what happens a lot in psychology is rather than talking about people doing things in places, we talk about constructs interacting with each other. So like people like depression moderates the interaction of self-objectification and like approach orientation, all of which are just clumsy ways of describing things that people did, where like the real story behind what all those words is the way that people like bubbled in a bubble over here when we asked them how sad they are, like was statistically related to how they bubbled in a bubble over here when we asked them like, how much do you think of yourself as an object? And this other question where it was like, how much do you want to go toward this thing? Like really, this is a story about people bubbling in bubbles on a computer screen. And when you put it that way, I think it becomes much clearer that like, oh, actually that story is not interesting. And it probably doesn't tell us that much that's important about human behavior. It's not always the case. Like sometimes people bubbling things in matters a lot. That is what literally voting is. And that has a huge effect. So like we do want to understand those behaviors. But I think when you think about psychology as the production of these stories, I think you can get better at picking out like which of these stories would matter in the first place.
So, this is a question I think was asked to Paul Samuelson. What is a non-obvious significant finding in your field? So I think Samuelson said in economics comparative advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there anything like that in social psychology?
Yeah, this is going to be an unpopular answer because like the narrative on these studies changes over time. I'll go into that. I think the Milgram studies are this. And like the level one, so the Milgram studies are back
Yeah,
in the
let's review
60s, a
them.
guy yes, yeah, in the basement at Yale, he basically got people to think that they're shocking someone to death when they really weren't. And the level one understanding of that study is, wow, people are so obedient to authority. Like, look what people will do just when they're told to. The level two understanding of that study is, actually, if you look really closely at it, like, did that really happen? Like, they were really pushing people. And a lot of stuff has come out of like, well, how much can we actually trust those results? I think the level three understanding, which is, of course, the top level understanding and the one that I inhabit, is that like, actually, this does tell us something extremely insightful about human behavior, which is, when they surveyed people and asked them, what do you think people would do in this situation? Like, what percent of people do you think would shock someone all the way to the end? And people said, like, basically no one. That they thought that, like, this was implausible, that you could construct a situation where people would do this thing where they thought that they were killing someone. And it actually turned out to be fairly easy to construct a situation where at least some people did that. And they did a bunch of different versions of this, but in one version, it was as high as 2/3. And I think that tells us something that like you can create situations in which people do things that just seem impossible for them to do. And I think that's actually one of the central findings of social psychology is this power of the situation, that you might think, well, there's good people and bad people. And so what's going to happen is the bad people will come in and do the bad thing. The good people will come in and do the good thing. Like, no, actually, the good people are going to come in and try really hard to be good. And if you can create a situation where being good actually does something bad, they're going to do a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of them.
Well, so isn't that also the insight of history?
Yeah, though I think you can look back on history and go, well, the people who did the bad things were bad people, and that's why they did them. And I think that was a hypothesis about like, well, the Nazis did the Holocaust because like, well, that's German culture and the German people. And like, you couldn't just have a Holocaust in any country. Like, you need a certain kind of person to do it. And I think a fair lesson is like, well, actually, anybody is capable of doing that in the right situation. Maybe not literally anybody, but far more people than we think are capable of doing that. And you can't write that off when it's like, well, this is a sample of mild-mannered people who don't do this in their everyday lives, who, vary in a bunch of different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think for me the best example would be the My Lai massacre,
Yeah.
because those are American soldiers and following orders, and I mean, okay, they're women and children there. They see them,
Yeah.
so they
Yeah.
can't say that this was like they were bombing from afar. And these people were just regular Americans. The colonel that was their commanding officer, there was actually a campaign to exonerate him, led by Jimmy Carter, actually, in
Yeah.
the early 1970s. If you check it out, so like history is like complicated, and To me, that seems. I mean, okay, like that seems obvious from history, but what you're saying is social psychology has like given us these controlled experiments now, and to some extent, you're quantifying it, and I think that is for me the value of a lot of behavioral science contemporary that dovetails well with historical sciences where we can see in aggregate social situations, is that okay, like you give like a quantity, like what percentage of people are extroverts, what percentage of people are introverts. Like we know from history that some people are this or that. We
Yeah.
have hypotheses that Stalin is a sociopath or a psychopath. Well, what percentage of people are sociopaths or psychopaths? Like what is the enrichment, what's the odds ratio of a dictator being this and that. I think that is definitely interesting. How do you feel about Joe Henrich and some of his colleagues' criticisms about psychology focusing on weird subjects? Because social psychology, from what I remember, and maybe it's changed, this is the social psychology of mostly white college
Yeah.
students in developed
Yeah.
nations, which it's a very narrow segment, and I know there's some universals, but still.
Yeah. I mean, these days it's mainly the psychology of people who are on Amazon Mechanical Turk. Um, I think if you open up pretty much any study these days, it's probably mostly that. Um, to that, I would say that's a fair critique when what you want to claim is this is something humans do universally, which is actually a really difficult claim to make in psychology. And in fact, most of what our studies are set up to do is create an existence proof that we can show not that something happens, but that it can happen. And this is actually why I think it's really hard to run a psychology study that is interesting, because you need to have a really good null hypothesis, which has to be that this can't happen. And actually, for most things that we have any possibility of testing, I think it's not that crazy to think that they can happen. And so you can create a situation where, like, okay, yeah, if you kind of say these words to people, you can create a group difference. But that doesn't mean that that actually happens in the world. It means that you could construct a situation where that does. I think that's actually why the Milgram studies are useful, because because people had the null hypothesis that like you couldn't create that, or that situation wouldn't do that, and you can show that like actually people had the wrong theory about that situation, um, which is why I think it's been the campaign of like judgment and decision making, or like heuristics and biases, has been so successful since the 1970s, that there is built in this null hypothesis that like people on average should get this right. And like, of course, we'll accept that they're inaccurate, but they shouldn't be biased on average, which is a fair default assumption, because there's wisdom of crowds. So long as people are just bad at this, they should cancel each other out. But if people consistently think that things that are easier to call to mind are actually more likely to happen or occur more often, then that's a bias. And I think that's why that work has been so successful, because it disproves a very reasonable null hypothesis. And that's also why I
Is
think a
that
lot of
null?
psychology fails. Yeah.
Yeah, is that null hypothesis that people would not do this or that? Is that like uh, related to the fundamental attribution error?
I think not exactly. So that's the idea, right? That you tend to attribute other people's behaviors to their dispositions rather than their situations.
Mhm.
And I think this is a little bit different. That this is the idea that like people can be plenty inaccurate at whatever task they give you, but they shouldn't judge things on average in a biased way. And that whenever they do, that's actually kind of interesting, because there must be some reason why you're pushing people in that direction. Um, so if people consistently think that you're more likely to die in a plane crash versus in a car crash, when we know that's not the case, um, people should get that on average correct if they're just naturally observing the world. Even though some people are going to get it wrong in another direction, some people are going to get it wrong in one direction. But when we find that actually people consistently get it wrong in the same direction, then it suggests that like, oh, something is going on there that's interesting. Um,
Systematic
because
bias.
yeah, yeah.
All right. So how do you feel? So I think most of the listeners, we don't need to like repeat the whole replication crisis, blah blah blah. Which it's not just a thing in psychology. It's kind of like a rolling
Yeah.
wave through academia because of the way statistics and not just statistics, but also just like the way scientific setup is with um, selection effects of you know just basically Google funnel plots science and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about in terms of effect sizes and p-values and all that stuff, right? So how I feel like in a way psychology is quite healthy because it went through the replication crisis really intensely about a decade ago, still going through it, Whereas other fields, like, so for example, biomedicine, I think still has not really faced up to what's happening, and it's going to be pretty
Yeah.
atrocious when it does, because we're not talking like little like college students pressing buttons on a computer.
Yeah.
We're talking there's going to be like a lot of people are going to pay for like what's going to happen. Honestly, like companies are going to pay for it. So, but let's talk about psychology. Like, how do you feel after the replication crisis? Do you think people are like it's changed a lot? I mean, I think you've probably were started your academic career right at the beginning of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just starting graduate school as like it really got bad. And my take on it is, yeah, it does seem like things have changed a lot, but I have this feeling that we maybe learned the wrong lesson from it, which is now people are really interested in getting to the bottom of, is this thing true or not? Is this thing a statistical artifact or not? Which is actually the second question that you should ask about anything. And the first is, would it matter if this is true or not? And I actually think, for the reasons we just discussed, the answer to that question for most psychology studies is no, it wouldn't matter if this is true or not. There's not a reasonable null hypothesis here. And I wouldn't pay any money to know whether this is true, because it wouldn't shift my understanding of the world at all. And if you don't ask that first question, you can waste a ton of time and resources trying to answer the second question about a finding that doesn't matter. And I feel like this is what we've actually been doing a lot of for the past 10 years. So one of the I think, poster children for this is ego depletion, which is this idea that, as you use your willpower, like you drain it. Which I think, again, like could be trivially shown to be true. I don't think anybody thinks that it is impossible that is true, or you can create some situation in which that is true. But what we spend a lot of time doing is testing out this one specific task where like you cross out E's on a page and then you do some other tasks where you need to use your self-control, or like you don't eat a cookie or you eat a rutabaga instead or whatever. There's various versions of this. And and at the end of it, we're like, oh, it seems like maybe it doesn't. But it's like, what was the question we were trying to answer in the first place? Like that people get tired? Because obviously they do. But if what we really want to know is like, well, does crossing out all the letter E on a page lead you to do something else? Like, obviously no one cares about that thing specifically, because nobody's sitting around all day crossing out all the bunch of letter E's. So what is it that we actually stood to learn here? I think that was a question that like no one's really, I think, asking, because it's a harder question to ask, and I think it's a little more uncomfortable. I think even as hard as it is to say like, I don't trust this result, like I think you p-hacked or whatever, it's a lot harder to go like, I don't think you could have provided useful information by doing what you did. Like that is, maybe philosophers can say that to one another. Psychologists are far too nice to be able to say that. And so instead, we'll rerun the statistics, but not question like, why did you get out of bed and do this in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so I have a mentor of mine he would say, he was like ecological geneticist, but anyway, he would say, you can find a lot of things that are true but trivial. There's no
Yeah.
point to that, and so is this what you're saying? It's like, okay, whatever, it's true, but whatever, I mean,
Yes.
there's no like
Yes.
there's no general inference you can make about the world. It doesn't fill in gaps in your, epistemological framework or whatever. Like you can use whatever words, but I think we all know what we're saying. It's like science is contingent. It builds on findings are
Yes.
building on each other. It's creating this kind of like network of information, and even adjacent fields are feeding into each other. So ideally, for example, neural networks are becoming like really big in population genetics now. Obviously, they did not start out in population genetics, computer science and neuroscience and stuff like that. So it's like science is progressive and it's building. And are you saying that some of these things are just kind of like one-offs? They're just like, okay, they're there.
Yes. Yeah, that like we had this idea that we're building this like great castle of science, and each stone is placed on another stone. And I think mainly what we have in psychology is just a bunch of stones in a field, like sitting alone. And so when people go up to one and like kick it to pieces and go, "Aha, this stone like wasn't solid. You can't build on this," but there wasn't anything built on it. And so what was the point of kicking it in the first place? Like, don't you want to try instead to build a stone that other people could build on? Or build on another stone that you think is actually worth building on. I don't really see us doing that. And I think it comes back to this idea of thinking that we are at the end of science, that like, if you think that, then you think it's really important to figure out whether each thing is true or not, because we're getting close to the end. Like, this is kind of all there is. And so it makes sense that we should start spell checking the document because we're about to turn it in. Whereas like the whole document could get deleted and we could start a new one tomorrow. I mean, this is especially true in psychology. And part of this is because like we don't really have a paradigm or an ontology. Like, we don't have a strong way of knowing what is useful and what isn't. Like, we don't have a big periodic table with some gaps missing where we're like, well, we have 39 and we have 41. So like someone should go out and find 40. And when you find 40, we're like, okay. Like, we know that it's probably gonna have these properties and it's probably gonna be useful for these things. Like, we don't have anything like that. And I don't think that's like to our shame or discredit. I think we've only really been at this a very short amount of time, maybe 1 to 200 years, but really like a generation, like truly in earnest. And actually, what makes it exciting for me to do psychology is that you still could like, control A and delete everything and start over again. And I don't think there's all that many things that I would bet would survive the next paradigm shift.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so here's a question. I haven't thought about this in detail. So, I don't know, like say like evolutionary biology, you have questions that like, you're driven by these big questions. Like why are complex life forms divided into two sexes with different gamete sizes? Uh, could, if you rewound history and let it go, would the diversification happen in the same way? Like, what is, convergent patterns and deterministic patterns versus stochastic patterns? These are questions that we're testing. What are the equivalents in psychology? I actually have never. Okay, I mean, honestly, just for the listener viewer, I mean, my experience with a lot of psychology, so cognitive psychology is a little different in my opinion, because I feel like they have, whether it's right or wrong, they have kind of certain models and all these things. But a lot of psychology is these neat results, and they're kind of
Yeah.
like the results that you will tell at a cocktail party. So there was a study, and I read a New York
Yeah.
Times article about it, and blah blah blah. But actually, now that you're talking, and I listened to your podcast with Erik, I don't really know. But where does that go? So how would it look? Like, I mean, what are the big questions that we're trying to solve? Do we have a soul?
I
I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I think honestly the big question is, what is the big question? That like, if we could pose the question better, we might do a better job. And I know that's kind of a cop out, but I do think we're still at that point where however long ago it was in chemistry, where we didn't even really know like, well, what stuff made out of, and it could have been a lot of different things, and like we didn't even really know what a thing was. Like, when you can't see it, is it even there? Are there things that are small enough that you can't perceive with the naked eye? I think we're kind of at that level. And until we figure out, like, we think the universe is kind of organized this way, it's really hard to make a lot of progress. It doesn't mean it's impossible. I do think we can produce results that like will ultimately end up in our understanding, because they are important and that they speak to some kind of truth. But I think actually finding those is basically a matter of applying intuition rather than applying pure logic. And I think that's actually what I was learning in my PhD, was like to sit in a room with a long time with a guy who I think had an intuition for doing exactly that. And now I try to do it myself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's weird. Okay, listening to you, this is not like super flattering, but I'm gonna just say it. Uh, because you're talking about chemistry, and but lesser extent biology. Let's talk about chemistry, because chemistry, in a way, has been around forever. The alchemists, they were
Hmm.
not really cranks in the way that they're kind of depicted. Like, they were trying hard.
Yeah.
They just didn't know the fundamental units of
Yeah.
Adam. They didn't have the theory, and so they're doing all these experiments and mixing things together, but they're trying hard. They were definitely proto scientists, and I mean, in biology, you have some similar things. If you read of some of Aristotle's ideas of the generative, like how flies come from mud and weird. Okay,
Yeah.
like, okay, they just didn't understand. Okay, but they were trying. And
Yeah.
then the pre-Darwinian theories of evolution, they were around actually, and they were kind of weird. The Lamarckian theory was actually one of the more coherent ones. So people have always had interest in life, interested in chemicals. Okay, but like they didn't have like a framework to actually work through it. I mean, are psychologists alchemists? Is that what you're saying? Try not
I
to be a
think
dick, but like
yeah,
listening to you, it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of stuff, but
yes.
and it's not like fake. You're doing a lot of stuff. The problem with alchemy was they didn't have the periodic table.
Hmm.
They didn't understand molecules and atoms. That's fundamentally the issue. If you don't understand molecules and atoms, it's going to be a problem. There was actually like Darwin didn't have a genetic theory, and that was like a huge problem for evolution for a while. And then all of a sudden, genes
Hmm.
were invented, quote unquote, or rediscovered,
Yep.
and then the math worked. You could actually do math. You know,
Yeah.
so I mean, just like we're kind of coming to the tail end. And I didn't mean
Yeah.
to say this, but like, hey, I guess it's a little spicy. Let's keep it spicy. I'm just like, bro, like, are you an alchemist? Like, what are you doing with your life? Like, how are you going to
Yeah.
get to the next stage, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is actually like a pretty like. I understand why this guy or this person wanted you fired from Quincy House or whatever.
Yeah, I'm poisoning the youth by telling them that we know so little. But again, I actually think that that's the reason I find this exciting. And look, like in the work that I do, I'm trying to do that thing of like, okay, what is a finding that I think could be useful somewhere? So like the paper that I published on my blog was trying to answer the question like, when we judge things as good or bad, what are we actually doing? Um, and I thought a reasonable way that the mind might do this is we judge things as good when it's easy to imagine ways that it could be worse. And we judge things as bad when it's easy to imagine ways that they could be better. And like, we are still early enough in this science that like, that's not a crazy hypothesis to have. And this hasn't been, shown one way or the other. And so what my friend and I did was ask people a bunch of questions of like, how could this be different? How could that be? How could cars be different? How could your pets be different? How could your life be different? People typed it out and we asked, okay, if it were different this way, would it be better or worse or just neutrally different? And people were like, it'd be better. It'd be better for every single item that we tested. We're like, okay, if we ask the question in a different way, does that change it? No. When we ask like, how could this be better or worse? People tell us better. When we ask them like, have you thought recently about how things could be better or worse? People say yes, and then they say better. When we ask Polish people in English, they do exactly the same thing. When we translate it into Mandarin, we get exactly the same answers. And so it really seems like people are naturally imagining how things could be better. And like, it could be that fact ends up being totally irrelevant to whatever our understanding of psychology becomes. But I think it's a useful one because 90% of our participants show it, which is very rare for a psychological finding. Normally it's like when it's on average, it's maybe a little bit more than half do it. It seems to be pretty hard to turn this off. So it seems to be something that we do quite a lot by default. And I think the reason it could be useful is because this might be one of the reasons the hedonic treadmill works. So we know that once you're pretty happy, it's hard to make you much happier. And like, I don't think anyone really has a good explanation for why that is. And I think this could be part of that explanation, that if you are by default thinking about how things could be better, even when things get better, you don't necessarily feel better. Um,
Mm.
and like, look, will all this get washed away one day as our revolution, our understanding of psychology gets revolutionized? Like, totally possible. Like, but I hope that is a block that's worth building on. And I at least think it's a block that when you kick it, it won't fall apart. But the more important thing
Mhm.
is, I think it was worth finding out whether that was true or not. It didn't answer our original question. I don't think this is how people judge whether things are good or not. But I think we found something else interesting along the way. So, am I doing alchemy? I mean, yeah, maybe. uh, and I hope that one day we aren't doing it. I think the only way of that ever happening is like to try to do the alchemy the very best you can until you realize why you can't, turn lead into gold.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, it was great talking to you. I'm gonna be honest. I'm not going to title this what I want to title it, "The Last of the Magicians," because not everyone's gonna get that reference. I think, but I that's what I'm thinking of. I mean, hopefully, you will be the last of the magicians. I think all of us here, like all the listeners and both you and me, me, Adam. I think we all want to know how the world works. And one reason psychology, at least from my perspective, gets, criticized a lot is because people care about it. People care
Yeah.
about how we behave in the world and how we think. And, we think, therefore we are. So this is one of the most important fields, actually, in the human intellectual endeavor, in scholarship. And so that's why something like the replication crisis, the fact that it's theory poor, these matter to people in a very deep way. I mean, solid state physics also matters to people with microchip development, but you can't have a conversation with a person on the street about that. So
Yeah.
this is also like just very, very fundamental to us as human beings. We have theory of mind. This is something, it's tried to say we can relate to it, but yes, we can relate to it. I mean, that we are thinking social creatures, and so if you study what is bracketed under social psychology, yes, it's going to be viral. Yes, it's going to be interesting, but it's also incredibly important. That means you should do it right. And,
Yeah.
as you said, do things that really matter, that make an impact. So I think I personally, I was kind of already on the, like, not gonna lie, I was already on the same page with you about peer review. I think a lot of people, especially younger people, they know that the rest of their, if they have like a decades long career, they're going to be operating under a different system. I think they're just waiting. And so sometimes someone
Yeah.
like you just pops off and says it. And that kind of
Hmm.
annoys other people who are in different stages of their career. But in general, someone like you or Erik Hoel, I mean, I really love the fact that you're grasping for reality. And, it's not always easy. And it doesn't always feel good, because most of the time in science, as we fail. You know,
Yeah.
it's like a litany of failures. But through those failures, we learn. It's also a thing in the startup world. So
Hmm.
there's similarities here. And I learned a lot from talking to you, and I hope the listeners and viewers learn a lot from listening and watching you. I don't know about the whole watching thing. I'm still skeptical of that, but I know that Zoomers love to watch people with their hand motions and their faces
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So I'm going with it. I'm going with it. All right. Thank you, Adam.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This podcast for kids